样加入思想先驱报的会员俱乐部呢？只要加入华尔街电视的会员，这样就可以在第一时间看到我们每期录制的最新节目了。如果您希望加入我们的讨论，在六度世界加入思想先驱报会员俱乐部，就可以参与我们会员网友的共同讨论。好，感谢我们观众朋友们对于我们的支持，感谢云水，感谢如是我闻，感谢甜甜金山，谢谢大家对于我们节目的支持。下周华尔街论坛与您再会。
欢迎来到中经分析。中国拯救楼市系列举措，抵离我们不远了。中经分析专栏作家李卫军。大约1周前，中国政府出台了一系列举措，力图拯救楼市。其中最引人注目的措施是央行出资3000亿人民币，用于直接购买市场上闲置的住房。事实上，此次救市政策出台之前，中国楼市出现的持续下跌，本质上是政府在过去几年打压房价，逼迫开发商降杠杆所引发的楼市慢挤兑。何为挤兑？以银行挤兑为例，若银行资产质量不好，储户预期银行资产的价值已经远远小于银行负债储户存款时，就会争先恐后去取款。道理很简单，因为银行以资不抵债，储户去晚了，就会面临取不出来钱的风险。具体到中国楼市，慢挤兑表现为投资者逐渐发现楼价已远高于其基本面决定的价值，并且难以继续上涨，因而逐渐卖出房子，从楼市中将钱取出，而引发的价格缓慢下跌。这样的情况出现其实是很危险的，因为任何一个微小的坏消息或事件会引发大量投资者恐慌性卖房，房价急跌，转变为挤兑，很难处理。举例来说，去年发生危机的瑞士信贷，在危机爆发前一段时间就已经出现了慢挤兑。挤兑的导火线是瑞信延期发布财报这一利空消息，引发了市场恐慌，慢挤兑变为挤兑，瑞士政府不得不出手干预。通常，一个有毒资产引发挤兑，影响到金融或经济稳定，其规模应以 GDP 的倍数来衡量。政府直接出资购买有毒资产，稳住价格，首先要面对的问题是耗资巨大。从这个意义上讲，中国的 GDP 大约为130万亿人民币，而此次救楼市，央行只拿出3000亿收购闲置住房，显然是不够的。一个更聪明和普遍的做法是政府做一个简单且模糊的承诺，稳定房价，出资购买过剩的商品房，而不言明具体金额。这样的承诺如果可信，投资者预期改变，挤兑也就止住了，最后政府可能就不必出资购买有毒资产了。我注意到，过去1周与央行出资收购闲置住房相配套的，还有一系列政策，包括降低首付和房贷利率，部分城市解除购房限制等等。这些新的政策组合，标志着过去几年紧缩楼市的政策转向，新一轮宽松开始。目前我们看到的政策显然也只是干预楼市的初始，未来肯定还会加码，因而我们也就无需纠结3000亿资金是否够用。这也意味着短期之内楼市的政策底已经出现。政府购买有毒资产的第二个常见问题是价格如何形成。举例来说，西红柿的标价是每公斤10人民币，但是卖不出去。那么政府来收购，价格应该定为多少？这其实是个很难回答的问题。这个问题意味着央行出资购买闲置住房的政策落实时会面临一些问题，需要一定时间。这一点，外加上文提到的初始剂量不足的问题，意味着楼市短期内的市场底还没有到来。但是，它离我们已经不远了。中经分析专栏作家李卫军系中国简报特约分析专家。
China's economy is in a slowdown. To get a better picture of how the slowing economy is affecting people on the ground, Bloomberg talked to people across a range of incomes and industries.
People with their own companies, entrepreneurs, people working in the financial sector, but also people working as window cleaners, people supplementing their income as Didi drivers.
Rebecca Chung-Wilkins is Bloomberg's correspondent for the economy and government team in Hong Kong. None of the people Bloomberg spoke to wanted us to record their voices for fear of repercussions in China. But by and large, people did tell us that they aren't feeling as well off as they did 5 years ago. One of them is Mr. Huang, who asked us to use just his last name.
He is an entrepreneur of sorts. He's a commodity trader in his 40s. And a few years ago, he started his own company, running his own outfit, essentially.
In the pre-COVID years, Huang was pretty successful and had a cushy life.
He bought an apartment in this very trendy district of Shenzhen. He also bought himself and treated himself to a Tesla Model X.
But things have really changed for him in the last few years. Huang says business has never been tougher.
So his business is essentially predicated on buying energy from generators and selling this to small factories. And what he told us is that he finds that these factories aren't wanting to lock in power contracts that as long as they previously would. And it's essentially because they're just not sure that there is going to be continued strong demand for their products.
All that meant Huang has had to make some hard decisions about his own business.
Ultimately, he's ended up sacking 5 employees in his firm because he has this worsening outlook over the market for 2024. And he talks about having last year to become a sort of so-called 软饭男.
Okay, wait. So you have to explain what is 软饭男.
So 软饭男 is this expression that literally translates as something like a sort of soft rice man. But this idea of being a soft man and not being able to provide for your family. And it's really a joke about the fact that he had to rely on his wife's income to take care of his family last year.
What Huang is experiencing is a new reality for many Chinese citizens.
Mr. Huang also tells us that he's far from alone in this situation. He talks about how a lot of the private business owners that he knows are trapped in this debt cycle, so they're borrowing new loans to pay old ones. And even those who were, for example, considering having more kids have had to cancel those plans because they can't afford to grow their family right now.
Rebecca says the negative sentiments the downturn is stirring up could be a real problem for the ruling Communist Party. And that's because for decades, the party has held power through a kind of bargain with the Chinese people.
So one way to think about this bargain or this relationship is as a kind of social contract. Essentially, people accept fewer freedoms in exchange for a promise of a better life. So Chinese people don't necessarily have an active say in how they're being governed. They don't get to vote in elections. But what they do get for the last several decades is a rapid increase in their prosperity. Now, some political scientists debate whether you can really call this a social contract because ordinary Chinese people don't have a say in that exchange. But there is still this broader question, which is what happens when that promise of prosperity, when that bargain starts to falter. And now we see that it isn't necessarily breaking down entirely, but we are starting to see these signs that the bargain is beginning to fray.
Welcome to the Big Take Asia from Bloomberg News. I'm Wan Ha. Every week, we take you inside some of the world's biggest and most powerful economies and the markets, tycoons, and businesses that drive this ever-shifting region. Today on the show, China's economic miracle is ending. So how does President Xi Jinping keep up the bargain that the Communist parties had with its people for decades? So there are a number of reasons why people in China aren't feeling great about the economy right now. The most looming setback is the property sector.
So the bulk of household wealth in China is actually held in real estate. About 70% of family assets are tied up in property. And for more than a decade, there was too much property speculation, too much building, and too much debt. And the consequence ultimately of this whole housing boom was that China was left with a huge amount of overcapacity in the real estate sector. Bloomberg Economics estimates that at the start of the 2020s, China was building about 30% more property than it actually needed each year.
At the end of 2021, one of China's biggest developers, Evergrande, defaulted on its bonds. Basically, they were unable to pay their debt to investors. Their default was followed by more than 36 firms that also struggled to manage their debt loads. Rebecca says the collapse in the property market has people feeling pessimistic about making other kinds of investments.
So Chinese people have gone from thinking, I've got this asset which is hugely valuable and accruing more value each year, I'm rich, to now thinking, I've got this asset which I thought was really valuable, but maybe it isn't, and I just don't feel quite as rich as I did a few years ago.
Another reason why some Chinese people aren't feeling quite as rich is wage cuts. The Common Prosperity Agenda, one of Xi Jinping's signature policies, brought crackdowns on multiple industries: technology, property, education, and even gaming. And that, of course, led to massive job and wage cuts.
在推进全体人民共同富裕上，
It aimed to close the wealth gap and lift the country's poorest. Here's what Bloomberg's chief economist Tom Orlik has to say on the policy.
What's the motivation for the Common Prosperity Agenda? Well, I think it's partly that China had a big problem with inequality. The rich were getting really, really rich, but a bunch of people were being left behind. So Common Prosperity is partly about addressing that problem. It's also about how to deal with a slower growing economy. When the economy is growing 8, 9, 10%, everyone's getting richer, everyone's feeling happy, everyone's supportive of Communist Party rule. When the economy is just growing 4 or 5%, well, you need to pay a bit more attention to how that 4 or 5% is getting shared out to make sure everyone's getting a little bit of the pie.
Now, to be clear, the official data show average incomes are still rising. More slowly, but still rising. But other indicators suggest that things might be less positive.
We look at business surveys. They show factories and offices thinking more about shedding workers than adding workers. We look at a survey from the central bank, which suggests that households are getting more and more pessimistic about their future earnings. So we don't have perfect clarity on what's happening in China's labor market or what's happening with China's wages, but the data we do have suggests at a minimum, wage growth is slowing and perhaps there are some more serious problems there.
All that leads to a shrinking of household spending. People aren't buying new houses or having kids.
So just like Mr. Huang mentioned when he talked to us, some of his friends no longer want to have children, or they're delaying plans to have children because they just don't feel like they can afford to. And this is a bigger problem, that people don't necessarily want to have babies if they're worried about being able to afford a bigger apartment to house another child, as well as account for all the extra costs, things like education, medical care. Essentially, it's this concern that they're worried about whether or not they have enough money and just how much it's going to cost to have a bigger family.
So, Rebecca, at the beginning of the show, we mentioned the bargain between China's ruling Communist Party and the Chinese people, right? You give us control, we make you prosperous. Now, China's current leadership is facing an ongoing real estate crisis. You've got slowing growth and income and a low fertility rate, among other things. On top of that, many Chinese may not be as hopeful about their futures right now. Is China's social contract being renegotiated here?
So the way we frame this question in our story is in terms of Ronald Reagan's famous question to US voters back in 1980, which is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And of course, back in 1980, for many American voters, the resounding answer to that question was no, I'm worse off, which is why Jimmy Carter lost the election and Ronald Reagan entered the White House. Now, China doesn't have elections, but it does have politics. And one of the reasons why politics in China has been so stable is because the Chinese Communist Party, for much of the past 4 decades, have been able to deliver this really stellar increase in prosperity. So if you ask Chinese people, are you better off than you were 5 years ago, which is the length of China's presidential term, at almost any point over the past 40 years, the answer would most likely have been, yes, I'm much better off than I was. But under Xi Jinping, the answer is quite a bit more complicated. So while average households are still seeing their incomes rising, they are rising at a much slower pace than they were. And anyone who put their nest egg in, say, Chinese real estate or equities will have taken a pretty significant hit. So Chinese households aren't necessarily feeling richer than they did. And in fact, many of them might be feeling poorer.
There was one moment where that prosperity evaporated at the end of the 1980s, where inflation and unemployment shot up. That was when we saw a genuine challenge to the authority of the Communist Party. That culminated in the bloody crackdown at Tiananmen Square. So, Rebecca, where are we now?
Well, we're certainly not in anything like as dire a situation as the end of the 1980s. Back then, we saw real incomes were actually falling, for example. But even so, we are seeing this shift from a long period of rapid rises in prosperity to a much more complicated situation where incomes are growing more slowly, wealth is falling. And all of that does mean there is a change in the social contract or a change in the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people.
After the break, how President Xi Jinping is managing the fraying of the social contract. The sound you're hearing is from the White Paper movement in 2022. That's when protesters held up blank sheets of paper to oppose COVID controls in Shanghai. And it eventually brought a rapid end to the lockdown that lasted 2 months. Since then, there's been striking developments in demonstrations in China over the past year.
Freedom House's China Dissent Monitor, for example, calculated that about 80% of all the protests that they documented for 2023 were related to the economy. We're seeing an increasing number of protests related to the economic strains that people are feeling these days, including failed real estate projects. But that isn't bubbling up into widespread protests that present any kind of existential challenge to the party. Well, it's really rare to see coordinated, widespread protest in China because of the sort of tightly controlled nature of society, which is heavily surveilled. So typically protests in China is quite small scale, it's quite sporadic, spontaneous in nature, and it very rarely targets the central government or President Xi Jinping himself directly with criticism. If we do see criticism of authorities, it's more often directed, for example, to local governments or local authorities who they may feel have not sufficiently protected them against certain risks.
But Tom says it's important to keep the recent slowdown in context. The average Chinese household is still much better off than they were, say, 40 years ago. And that buys the party a certain amount of goodwill from the people. Plus, things are bad, but they aren't that bad.
We don't have mass unemployment. We don't have average incomes falling. We don't have a financial crisis. So we're talking about a slowdown for many, a stagnation for some, but we're not talking about an economic crisis.
Meanwhile, the Politburo, China's highest policy-making body, is signaling that it will take action to help support the economy.
So in economics, as in fairy tales, the magic number is very often 3. And I see 3 planks to the Chinese Communist Party's strategy to deal with this new problem of slower income growth and falling wealth. The first strategy is to stimulate. We're not seeing the big bazooka stimulus that we've seen in past Chinese downturns, but Beijing has definitely got out a bunch of water pistols and it's trying to douse the flames in the property sector and ensure that incomes and wealth don't fall too far. The second part of the strategy is something that political scientists call preventative repression. That's the technological panopticon which gives China's 1.4 billion citizens the strong sense that whether they're online or walking on the street, somebody's watching them. And the third part of the strategy is what Xi Jinping calls common prosperity. It's the idea that the pie is going to grow more slowly, but it's going to be shared out in a more equitable way. It's kind of a grab bag of different policies, fines for the tech monopolies, instructions to the gig economy companies to pay their workers at least a living wage. The crackdown on the real estate sector, which is causing enormous pain for China's economy writ large, but is also bringing down house prices and making them more affordable to first-time buyers.
And Rebecca says it's important to remember that the Chinese economy has multiple engines for growth. It's not just about real estate. She says the government is eyeing new growth drivers.
One way to think about the Chinese economy is like an aeroplane, so that has 2 or 4 engines, so different engines and different things that are driving it. Now, property is one of those engines, but there are other things too. There are things like exports that rely on global demand. And what we're kind of currently underway is a plan by Xi Jinping and by Beijing to change what engines are driving that plane and what is essentially keeping that plane up in the air. And as that happens, naturally, of course, you get quite a bit of disruption. And if you're on the plane, you look at that property engine and it looks like it's on fire. Of course, people start to panic. You start to really worry.
Yeah, and of course, it's not going to be helpful to tell people not to panic.
Absolutely. It doesn't help to see one of those engines caught on fire. And it's very hard then to try and restore confidence. Ultimately, the goal is to get consumers back on the streets and spending. It's hard to do that if you see property in the state that it is. It's hard to be convinced that you should go out and invest in a business. But that's not to say that, of course, the economy is anywhere close to the precipice of collapse, because you definitely still have these other engines of growth. And in the meantime, Beijing is, of course, trying to institute these other mechanisms. So look at, for example, the 3 new drivers, things like solar panels, EVs, batteries, where the hope is that they will start to make up some of the losses that you're seeing in other parts of the economy.
And to better understand Reagan's question, are you better off in the China context, Bloomberg looked at 2 data sets, one on economic growth and another on political freedom. Bloomberg's analysis suggests China has come full circle in those 2 respects.
So we looked at IMF data on China's GDP growth, and we looked at a political science data set on freedom in China. That includes things like freedom of the press, freedom for academics, and freedom to express your opinion in public, for example. And these 2 data sets, when you bring them together and look at how growth and freedom have evolved in China over the last 40 years, they tell a really striking story. So back at the start of the reform era, or even before the reform era began, we see that growth was really weak and freedom was really constrained. And then if we go through and look later during China's leadership under Deng Xiaoping, freedoms expanded and growth accelerated. Under Jiang Zemin, freedoms remained in place and growth remained strong. And then finally, under Hu Jintao, you saw the beginnings of a slowdown in growth, the beginnings of an erosion of social freedoms. Finally, under Xi Jinping, the erosion of growth and the narrowing of social freedoms has continued to the point where China has almost come full circle, with growth slower and freedoms more constrained. Though it is important to bear in mind that, of course, living standards under President Xi Jinping versus under Mao Zedong are much, much higher.
How did you grow up? You grew up in Hong Kong, and how did you get interested in whatever ended up, in your field right now?
All right. I grew up in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a British colony at the time, and most people in Hong Kong were rather relatively poor. At the time, it was like a developing, I mean, it's not a country, it's a colony. It's a developing society, and most people were not very well educated at the time. And my parents' generation, they all got clobbered by the war and the World War II, and the education were interrupted, and many of them don't formally go to school, and both of my parents did not finish high school, and but they were just like many Asian parents. They are very adamant that all the children should be well educated, and that's what they put the emphasis on. So I went through a very grassroots type family. We live in very cramped apartments, and when I was at a very young age, we kind of won the lottery from the government, because at the time the government was building plenty of government housing, high-rise apartments that have that they rent out to the population at very low prices, low rent, and so we sort of won the lottery and moved into one of those, and that really changed our trajectory. And we stayed there. I grew up there in the housing project, and later on, as our family got a little bit more resources, we moved out to private housing. But the early years, we grew up in a housing project, which really immersed us into the general public of the society, which gave me a pretty good perspective of what the society is about.
Who would have put more premium on education amongst your parents? Was it your dad or your mom?
Both of them, because they didn't have a chance to go through formal education, and so they realized, and right after the war, everybody needs to make a living, so to speak, and so there wasn't much of an opportunity for them to get a formal education. So they are very insisting that everybody should in the family should be well educated.
How did you discover electrical engineering? I mean, you could have done other things, right?
Yeah, I could have done other things. That was, I guess, the society at the time gravitated towards STEM type education, because that seems to be a kind of like a ticket to a better life, better career. And the humanities and the arts are less well defined. For example, if you're licensed to become an engineer, then of course you're licensed to practice, you got a good career and so on. Whereas the other profession seems to be more nebulous and less well defined. And so a lot of the kids at the time who did well in school tend to pick one of the STEM fields to go into, and so no exception for me. Follow the crowd and enter kind of go into a science type curriculum. And out of the science type of curriculum, the physics and the chemistry part of the science curriculum is more kind of quantitative and formal, and makes it easier to quantify, and at least for me, it's easier to understand. And rather than, for example, in biology, for example, it's more to me at the time, it looks like a more observational science. You need to remember a lot of things.
Right.
And I'm not very good at remembering things. So
you're being modest.
So the physics and the chemistry looks better. Now, when I was about to enter college or university at the time, the careers for people who study basic science is rather limited, because it's not a basic science research as in the US it is today, right? But being a basic science researcher is not a career in Hong Kong at the time, right? So most of the science type careers are more practical. Engineering is one of them. So many of our contemporaries becomes engineers. And out of all the engineering, electrical engineering is closest to physics. And it used many of the same concepts in physics, quantum mechanics and electromagnetics and so on. They're more closer to physics, so that's why I got attracted to it.
Yeah. I think it's probably safe to assume that countries or nations or governments or political cultures within each that would have put strong emphasis on STEM, they tend to have done well, as opposed to those that probably put less emphasis on STEM, right? Would you attribute this to the political culture in your household, or sort of like the pervasive political culture at any dimension, at any level? Or you think this would have been something that would have been driven by the leadership of that country, that nation, or the government?
I think if you talk about, if you look at many of the Asian countries, they have this strong emphasis on STEM.
Yeah.
And my crude understanding is that from an economic development point of view, you do need these skills from an economic development point of view. If you want to build infrastructure, you need engineers to build the bridges and roads and so on and so forth. If you want to have industry, you need people who can do the engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and so on and so forth. That's, I think, mostly coming from the point of view of economic development. But I should say that economic development in and of itself only takes you so far. At some point, the society will need things other than economic development.
Yeah.
And that's where the humanities and the arts and so on comes in, that people in society are not just simply satisfied with the money.
Right.
But beyond, there's a lot more than making a living. Once you are comfortable about making a living, then you look for something else. I think that is the part that a lot of the Asian countries may not have recognized.
I'm just, sensing that there's still quite a lot of countries that have not focused on STEM as much as some countries that we might have seen.
Why so?
Not sure. I mean, I'm in the camp that believes that I think a higher degree of focus on STEM is correlated with your ability to move marginal productivity, because that's correlated with innovation and all that good stuff, right? And being able to combine that with liberal arts or humanities, I think that makes it even more a good combination. But some countries, I think, tend to focus a lot less on STEM. And that I think has hampered development to some extent. And I'm just happy with how Hong Kong, has put a lot of emphasis on STEM, along with some other Asian countries, such as Korea, China, Japan, and now recently, you've talked about Vietnam and Southeast Asia, right? You can see that in the tenacity with which the people of Vietnam, I think, are focusing on STEM. I come from a region, called Southeast Asia, where I think the focus on STEM needs to be, more emphasized going forward. You went to Hong Kong University.
Yeah.
Then you decided to move to the US.
Yes.
Why?
Well, very simple. I am interested in kind of more advanced knowledge beyond the bachelor's degrees type education. I was looking for a place where I could get a PhD. At the time, it was in early 80s. None of the universities in Hong Kong are what you would call a research university. They're basically teaching universities. Just in the colonial days, the universities in Hong Kong meant to train bureaucrats for the civil servants in service of the government, and they're not interested in doing research. So there's really no opportunity to do any research in Hong Kong. Yeah. So I came to the US.
And it's worked out okay with you?
So
You've
far,
done very well.
I'm okay, I guess.
Now I want to shift gear to your area of focus. I mean, I know you're teaching electrical engineering, and you're one of the few people that understand the semiconductor, sector. Why is it called semi, not full conductor?
That's interesting. But before I get to that, let me just finish by your previous question. I think my kind of journey from Hong Kong to the U.S. is a very typical journey for many immigrants who are in the technology field.
Right.
They got educated in their home country and came to the U.S., saw an opportunity to get better education, and then many of them do stay. And I think it's a very important source of talent for the U.S. And maybe we could come back to that later. But I think it's really important. If you look around in academia, in industry, many of them do come through this route of getting an advanced degree and ended up staying.
It's been the main source of innovation in the U.S.
Absolutely. If you look at top management CEOs of big companies, many of them come through this route. And that's very important.
Yeah. Well, while on this, I mean, do you see that as something that's likely to continue, given?
I think that's in jeopardy.
Okay.
Given the recent,
the political calculus seems to be.
Seems to be the pendulum has swung to the other side in recent years, and you see a lot of soul searching about immigrants or foreign students and openness in research and things like that. And that, I think, that creates an environment in which, when for a potential student from other countries looking at the U.S., and they would begin to think about whether this is the right place for them, or rather they would go to some other countries to get your education and the experience. When I was just graduating from college, that answer is very obvious. Where do you go? The U.S., of course. But now
you've got optionalities.
Now we got options, and also not only options from a pull point of view, but from a push point of view.
Correct.
A lot of people felt that the U.S. may not be so welcoming as before, and so that, I think, that route or that flow of people is somewhat in jeopardy.
On the other question, why is it called semi?
Oh, why is it called semiconductor? I forgot who I heard it from when somebody talked about semiconductors, and somebody who's not in the field asked, why semiconductor? How come a full conductor is not better? Cup half full? Well, what is a semiconductor? A semiconductor is a material that, as its name implies, not very conducting, not very insulating, and somewhere in between. And why do I want something in between? It's because a full conductor would be something like a piece of metal, like copper or silver or that kind of thing, right? So a full conductor. Now, not a full, but a real conductor, basically. Why semiconductor? Semiconductor is used to build switches, like electrical switches, wall switches, flip on the switch and turn on the lights. And computers are actually a bunch of switches. We compute by designing the organization, arranging switches, how to route the switches around. In the early days, the telephone, you have a switchboard, and you have real people who connect one line with another, that in a switchboard. And all these are replaced by chips today, of course. And so computers do computation by flipping switches, basically. So a semiconductor can be turned on to be conducting, or be turned off to be not conducting. And that basically is what a switch is about. So a semiconductor is used to build switches. And so that's why semiconductors are useful, because it can be turned on or turned off.
Gordon Moore, he came up with this prognosis decades ago that, things were going to behave in a certain way by way of the capacity growth, the speed growth, It's been very, very accurate.
Yes.
Right? Every year and a half to two, the doubling of the capacity and the speed. What's going to happen with Moore's Law?
Okay, first of all, that Moore's Law, which we refer to doubling of something, initially he was just suggesting doubling the number of transistors on a chip. And later on, people modified it and double anything, which is not really what he meant, but people can tend to associate it with Moore's Law that way.
Right.
But that one is basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's actually a rather unusual situation for a technology or for industry. I believe one of my colleagues, Professor Jim Plummer, said that he's not aware of any other industry that has this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, namely that everybody thinks that in X number of years, such things will happen.
Right.
And so because companies are competing, because there's a prediction out there, companies are trying to either meet or exceed that prediction so that you can be better than your competitor. So as a result of that competition to get to that particular goal, that goal is satisfied because of the intense competition. And also, that also not only just the desire to compete, but also having a goal allows everybody up and down the chain, the entire chain of events, from materials to device technology to circuit design and architecture and so on and so forth, up and down the chain to have a predictable cadence. Let's say I'm designing something. I need what I designed to be run on some kind of chip. Now, I cannot start designing the chip unless I know what the chip technology can do, what the capability is. Just like if you try to run a marathon, right. I cannot win the marathon unless I know what my capability is. So you need to know what the capability is before you can design your chip. Now, without that prediction, you wouldn't be able to say, I'm going to design this based on this assumption that the chip technology will give me this kind of performance. I cannot do that. But with this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, I know in 2 years, the chip technology will advance to a point where I can count on that particular performance. And so therefore, I will tailor my design based on that assumption. And that's very powerful.
Very powerful. It sort of framed the behavior of the industries.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Consistently for decades. Even that I gave the example of designing chips, even down to the material supplier. The material supplier knows that the chip manufacturer will need this kind of material or will need this kind of material to have that kind of performance in 2 years. So therefore, I work on developing it with the full knowledge that when I get done, I will have a customer. That's risk mitigation is very important. If I develop something, I spent millions, multi-million dollars developing something. I didn't know whether there's a customer. But that's bad.
Yeah.
But in this case, I know.
At the risk of quoting you in previous conversations, at the rate that the percentage of how the chips occupy our lives, if not lifestyles, at an increasing rate, whether it's opening your window in the car, turning on your toaster, turning on your microwave oven, whatever, before you get to the more complex stuff. What's going to happen to Moore's Law? Is it likely to be more exponential than whatever we have seen in the last few decades?
I think there are two dimensions of it. Well, for short answer, yes, it's going to be more exponential.
Yeah.
Okay. Why do I say that? First, for the last several decades, we know that there's one way to improve the performance of the chips, which is to make it smaller. And there are a lot of physics involved and to explain why making it smaller is better. Right? So we know that there's one way, and we've been kind of turning that knob for several decades now.
Right.
And that knob has kind of saturated a little bit, just like anything else. You put the gas pedal, it hits the floor. Right? In the beginning, you're accelerating, but then pretty soon you hit the floor. Right? So that's for sure. But that doesn't mean that progress will not continue to be made, because there are many other knobs. There are many other ways to make progress. It's just the analogy I'd like to have is, for the past 50 years, we've been walking inside a tunnel. There's only one way ahead. We know what the goal is, and we just want to make progress. And to make progress, that's one, making devices, making transistors and memory smaller will allow us to pack more devices on the same chip and therefore get more functionality, better performance, and so on. That method is the one method that we know, and that is saturating, but it's more or less like walking inside a tunnel. There's no way to go, it's the only way forward. But now we're at the exit of the tunnel. Now at the exit of the tunnel, there are two ways to interpret it. One, you fall off the cliff, you're just dead. Second is the world is open, wide open, no more confining. You cannot go left or right. You can go anywhere you want. And I think my interpretation is we're at the exit of a tunnel. There's so many possibilities, and we will continue to grow in capability in an exponential way, or even faster. Now, why am I so optimistic about that? Is because necessity is the mother of inventions. And that my optimism arises from the fact that society demand more from these chips, not less. The society will demand more and more from semiconductor technologies, chip technology in the coming decades than we have done in the past few decades. So because it's coming from the demands, innovation will come up and bring the technology up in a much faster pace than before, because we are not confined by the tunnel anymore.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Geopolitics could go wrong. Okay. I think that's a very important aspect that wasn't there just maybe like a handful of years ago. I think that is an important part, because research and development thrive on collaboration. And there are many, many examples. We can go into that a little bit more later. But it thrives on collaboration. And if geopolitics cause collaboration to not happen, then the rate of progress will be severely curtailed. I think that is something that could go wrong.
You know, we're going through this era of what I call multipolarity, right? And I've said it before that ironically, in a multipolar world, multilateralization becomes more difficult, because there's this tendency of revisionism by the new middle powers or greater than middle powers, right? And the pre-existing superpowers are not comfortable in embracing this new mode of multipolarity. I want to put this in the context of what you've been affiliated with, TSMC, right? They've basically created a recipe for success that involved a lot of collaborative undertakings, right? From a supply chain standpoint, from a research and development standpoint, from what have you, not just amongst enterprises, but also between academia and policymaking and entrepreneurship, right? What made them the way they were or they are?
I think your observation is extremely astute in the sense that a lot of people think a company like TSMC is a collection of factories and tools,
right,
or even just factory workers, and that's about it. But really, it is not. It is a enterprise that involves a lot of collaborations, that thrive on the network of customers, network of suppliers, network of collaborators in research and development, network of collaboration with the broader society that in which they lives in,
right,
the Taiwan society. It is a network of all these things and even more, perhaps, I didn't go into. So that piece, that collection of relationship is what makes this company the way it is. Let's say we all of a sudden transplant this company to another country or another place that doesn't have the same political economic system. It is highly questionable whether they can continue to operate the way it is.
Yeah. So how do other countries try to replicate just any bit of what TSMC might have been able to do? And I'm not singling TSMC out here. There have been others that have been legendary and great, right?
Yeah.
The Samsungs of the world, the Intels of the
Absolutely.
world. But I think TSMC has proven itself to be very resilient and very different. And their success seems to be sustainable so far.
So far, yes.
Right? And go back to the history of how it came about. Go back to that conversation between Morris Chang, the legendary Morris Chang, with, somebody or some people in Taiwan that made it the way it has become.
I think there are two, if not more, at least two very important elements. One, technology competition is really a talent competition. First, talent.
Yeah.
Second, the broader society's support of the industry, not just the company, but the industry itself. You need a infrastructure for the company to exist, and suppliers, customers, and so on. So let's talk about talent first.
Right.
Taiwan in the early days of the 60s, 70s through the 80s and 90s have sent, well, it's not that the government sent them, but students from that era, all after they graduate from college, they all went out to the US, to Europe, outside of Taiwan, who has more advanced education achievements in the universities to get education. And many of them stayed in the local host countries to gain work experience. And in time, many of them go back to Taiwan to continue the career for a variety of reasons. Want to be closer to home. And I guess that's maybe perhaps one of the biggest draw, be closer to home, or perhaps a perceived better career opportunity in the home country. So like playing in the home field, right? So which people sometimes feel more advantageous, and knowing the culture and the people well. So talent, the flow of talent is one of the most important things. If you look at the leaders of the tech industry in Taiwan today, many of them were educated in the US through this route, getting educated in college, go to other countries, the US, Europe, and so on, and go back to Taiwan, have a work experience, go back to Taiwan, bring the work experience, bring the knowledge with them. And that is very important. That is, I would say, perhaps is the one of the major
criteria.
Ingredients for the success. And it's not just limited to Taiwan, Korea as well.
Yeah.
We look at the many top management in Samsung and Hynix and so on. Many of them were educated in the US. So that's one part of it. But that's one piece. But the other piece, which is important, is support of the society. If you think about how the semiconductor industry was started in Taiwan, it was really supported by the government. It's industrial policy, basically. The Taiwan government decided that this is an industry they want to get into, and they support it with building industrial parks, with starting ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, which spun off TSMC and many other companies as well. So the government really have a really robust industrial policy. Now, of course, industrial policy may or may not succeed. If you bet on the wrong thing, that's bad, right? And that's really, of course, if you're in the U.S., you know that the U.S. feels that they don't need an industrial policy, right? And we don't go into that. But in this particular case, industrial policy worked out for them, and the government really supported it, building industrial parks, finding other pieces of the puzzle to fill in the infrastructure for the semiconductor industry, and also basically the technology industry back in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. Taiwan basically manufactured, but basically it's the world's manufacturer for PCs and
everything, even bicycles.
And bicycles, bicycles as well, yeah. And so the government really supported it with really strong industrial policy.
That's amazing. Now, in early days, a lot of the intellectual property with respect to the microchip technology was done in the U.S. Do you think that with the benefit of hindsight of the U.S. were to decide otherwise, meaning they would have wanted to onshore the manufacturing capabilities as opposed to offshore the manufacturing capabilities, would things have been different?
This is a very complex problem that I've been thinking about more recently, and I haven't come to any reasonable resolution or answer yet. And I can tell you what the kind of disconnect or problems are. One is, in the US, this, as I said, this is a technology competition, it's a talent competition. If you look at the cost of talents in Asian countries and in the US, the cost differential is pretty high. Right. So it's
getting smaller, but back then it was huge.
Oh, it was huge. It was huge, right? So to get talented people working on hard engineering problems in, let's say, in Taiwan or in Singapore or in Korea is way less costly than it is in the US. So in other words, they could deploy many high-skilled talents to solve engineering problems, whereas the US is at a disadvantage in terms of cost. Not capital cost, but just talent cost, right? Give an example. I recently went through more than 20 years of TSMC annual report. Every year, they report on the education level of the employees. Starting from 1999, about 40% of the employees have a bachelor's degree and above. Today, 80%.
Wow.
Now, that coincides precisely with the steady climb in the technology ladder, the leadership race, the steady climb from beginning. They were licensing it from RCA, licensing technology from the US and bring it back to Taiwan. Gradually, they learn how to do things themselves. And the way to do that is to get talented people. So they started from 40% people, employees who has a bachelor's degree and above, to today, 80%. And so that really tells you technology competition is a talent competition.
Yeah. Okay, in this context, which other countries do you think have done as much or just about the same amount that Taiwan has done? And I mean, when you think about talent, you think about human capital, you think about countries that have shown, right, abilities to project intellectual capital, right? Within Asia or within the world, which countries do you think are likely to be able to emulate the kinds of successes that we've seen in Taiwan?
Well, I've seen countries like Singapore, Korea have been tremendously successful.
Yeah.
Like Korea, I remember back in the 60s and 70s, Korea was nowhere to be found,
nowhere,
right?
Yeah.
And then later on, they have kind of Me Too type products.
Right.
And we associate those
kind
of
of products. You usually start out with Me Too's.
Yeah,
then you start
with Me
being
Too's.
innovative and unique.
Exactly.
Right.
And then slowly they climb up the learning curve. And I remember years ago when you see Samsung, I said, what the heck is this?
Yeah. Well, now it's
not
very
reliable.
different.
Now it's the best thing in the world. So these countries have done quite well.
What about China?
China is, I don't think we could ignore their capability. They have, let me talk about something that I'm familiar with, just research.
Right.
I'm academia, I know
Yeah.
research. Years ago, we have technical conferences and we see papers from China, say, forget it. Just quality is so bad. It's not even competitive.
No, it's very different.
Now, that was probably in the 80s and the 90s. Now, they're better than us. They're better than us. If you look at, papers, publications, data from key conferences in the chips business. For example, in the International Electronic Devices Meeting, which is a device technology conference, the biggest one in our field. International Solid-State Circuits Conference, the Circuits and System Conference in our field, the two biggest conferences in our field. You basically flipped. Years ago, the U.S. had the majority of the papers. I remember there were roughly about 40 to 50% of the papers from the U.S. And China, maybe 20, 30 years ago, there were nowhere to be found. Today, China and Asia, the papers are more than 40%, almost close to 50%.
Oh my gosh.
And the US has steadily declined from 40, 50% to 30 to 40%. And the rest of the world, principally Europe and Japan, has basically fallen off the cliff. So the research and development, the research capability in Asian countries, China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on, have really become the strongest region in terms of producing good quality research. I'm not just talking about quantity, just quality. And the only thing that I see that the US is still a little bit ahead is in coming up with the new ideas. What the Chinese always say, going from 0 to 1. Namely, starting from nowhere, nothing, and come up with this really new idea. And if I look at what I would call new idea that is not been discussed before, the U.S. still, if you read the research papers, the U.S. still is the principal place where these new ideas come from. But once these new ideas become known, then
you see mushrooming of this new ideas in other places.
Exactly. And I feel it in my everyday research with my students.
Oh my gosh.
Any new ideas that we come up with, once they become known, this is a good idea.
And next week it will show up in China.
It will actually show up in China. Not only that, they do it better than you.
Yeah.
I cannot compete anymore. They have better resources. They have more students. They have more funding from the government. I cannot compete anymore. I have to get out of that field.
I want to get back to this, but I want to ask you about two countries like India and Israel. I mean, they have tremendous human capital, right? Do you see them as contenders in being able to, replicate the kinds of successes?
India
that
has
we've seen in
tremendous
Taiwan?
potential. It's tremendous potential. Their human capital is unbelievable. Not only they are a very populous country, of course.
Right. They got scale.
They got scale, right? And the statistics work out for them, right? When you have scale, then there are going to be outliers who are really smart and very innovative and so on, just like China, right? So that they have, that's very important. I think they have tremendous potential if they do things right, because they got scale, the people are smart, right? And in terms of Israel, they don't have scale. They're a small country, but they are smart people, obviously. The difficulty they have is lack of scale.
A bit like Singapore, then.
Yeah, a bit like Singapore, right? In Singapore,
a lot of smart people.
5 million people.
Yeah, 5.5.
Yeah.
It's finite.
Yeah, finite. Yeah. They don't have scale.
Going back to China, with the advent of AI, how do you think the speed of new ideas creation is going to be impacted?
I think the speed of new ideas...
You can get AI to create a paper, right? Pretty much.
Yeah, but I think ideas still come from people. It's the acceleration from an idea to something useful that AI will be able to help with. The ideas still come from people, but today there are a lot of barriers and times and efforts required to bring some idea to fruition. Perhaps the advent of AI would shorten that life cycle, but the ideas still come from people, I believe. Now, AI would really help with the US and more advanced countries to get back into the game of manufacturing. Let me explain why. I mentioned earlier that the cost of human capital you cannot ignore it. The differential is there because of the standards of living and so on and so forth. It's there. Now, with AI and robotics, we should be able to make a lot of progress in advanced manufacturing, because in advanced manufacturing, you need many high-skilled people, because those manufacturings are so complex. It's not like repeatedly doing things over and over again according to a recipe. You need to be able to understand the process, improve on it, and those require high-skilled people, highly educated people. Now, the developed world have a very high cost for human capital. That being the case, you want to make really good use of those people. Those productivity has to be much higher. And the advent of AI, robotics would allow developed countries to deploy these highly skilled people much more effectively than before. And so using that would allow us to level the playing field a little bit about the cost of high-skilled labor.
In the next 10 to 20 years, how do you see the landscape of the competition? In terms of countries. I mean, I think China is definitely pouring a lot more money onto this. The United States seems to be wanting to put more money onto this, not just on the IP side, but also on the manufacturing side. Mm-hmm. Korea seems to be very tenacious, right? How do you see the landscape?
It's
a bit like a Sputnik moment.
Yes.
From a chip standpoint.
Yeah. And not only chip, but many technology as well. Many other technologies you can think about, like, electric vehicles, batteries, and so on. And they're all like that, right? So the world is becoming a little bit, the world of manufacturing or technology becomes a little bit more polarized, right? So you kind of separate into 2 camps or 2.5 camps and things like that. And people need to, some countries will need to play both sides and find their way around. But generally speaking, we think of it as 2 camps, right? Now, that being the case, then as I mentioned earlier, for technology to advance, you really need open science. You need collaboration. So now being that there are 2 camps, they don't talk to each other, that means things are going to go slower. What does that mean? That means the society is going to benefit less because things are going to go slower, right? Second is the separation of supply chain, costs will go up. Right? You need to find your suppliers, not the lowest bidders, but thinking about geopolitical situation, so cost is going to go up. Now, the question is, who's going to absorb those costs? And it's not clear who's going to absorb those costs. And today, if you look at, in part, why manufacturing in the US is such a bad situation today is, in part, I believe, I'm no economist, I'm just guessing. I'm an engineer, right? So maybe an economist listening to this podcast would say, wait a minute, what's this guy just talking about, right? But my guess is that the distribution of profits is not equitable across the entire chain. The companies who are operating at the top of the food chain, they glean most of the profits. I'll give you an example. I was just at Western Digital the other day, and they told me that if you want to buy iPhone with more storage, they charge you $100 or $300 more. But the people who make the chips to make it happen get a few dollars. So
you were talking about level playing field,
right?
There's not a lot of equity there.
There's not a lot of equity there, right? So this situation needs to be corrected. Otherwise, the manufacturing in the U.S. is not going to go well. I remember, for example, we talk about talent, right? I was once in a panel discussion with a bunch of semiconductor companies, and one person from company lamented that, we couldn't hire people. And nobody wants to join my company. We have positions we need to fill and so on and so forth. Lack of talent, lack of workforce. So I asked him, how much do you pay them? And he went silent. He couldn't answer my question.
Wow.
Why? Because they couldn't pay them to compete with the other people who reaps the profit, right? And because they couldn't pay them, they couldn't get enough profits, so that's why they couldn't pay them, and so they couldn't hire the people.
So this scarcity of talent is really structural.
It is structural.
Right?
It's not so much. A lot of people thought that, we just need to tell the universities to offer more courses. No.
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen. You need to have the demand. I could offer 10 courses, but if nobody take my course, it wouldn't help you at all, right? You need to have the demand from the students. And where do you get the demand from the students? The students need to know that they have a bright career in front of them if they take these courses. If they go into this field, they will have a good career. Today is not the case for many of these manufacturing related jobs.
So you're suggesting, if I get you correctly, there's likely to be a deceleration of the competition by way of the polarization.
If we haven't managed it right.
Right. Well, hopefully we'll manage it better, right? And also the scarcity of talent.
A scarcity of talent.
I think it applies on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Right? The scarcity of talent.
It's not just on this side of the Pacific. I think it's on the other side of the Pacific too.
Exactly.
Given the scale, of course.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And that has to do with how the profits are fairly shared.
Right.
Because the companies who are doing the manufacturing and all the things below in the supply chain are not getting enough profits to offer good compensation, to offer good working environments to the employees.
So even within the supply chain, there's some players that are actually making disproportionately more than the other.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
That's a structural impediment.
Yeah, it is.
To the desired speed with which you want to move.
It is. I think the policy makers and the economists have to recognize that. Otherwise, it is structural.
The aspiration to onshore in the U.S., there's been some conversations, discussions, and initiatives for TSMC to build a plant here and there in the U.S., including in Arizona. Do you see that moving smoothly or as smoothly as aspired? Or
Well, I was at this big conference in December. I told you earlier, Field Speakers Conference. I saw all my colleagues from around the world, from Europe and Japan and so on. My Japanese friends are all laughing at us. You guys are the slowest.
Oh, yeah. That's public knowledge, I guess. Wow. Now, talk about, there's the logic chips, there's the memory chips, and there's the special chips, right? We call it discrete or whatever. How will that fare going forward in terms of who's going to be more dominant than the others within each one of those three categories?
I think those three categories, they're all important. Yeah, it's not like one is more important than the other. They're more important. Like, for example, we're doing this podcast, right? You need computers to crunch the data and stream the thing out.
Oh, and to store it too, somewhere.
Yeah.
Up
and
in the
you need
clouds.
storage to store it, right?
Yeah.
And the microphones, the video cameras, they all made of chips. Those are specialty chips, right? So they're all important. Right? And so we couldn't say, oh, we can just do without one of them. No, we cannot. They're all important. Now, as far as resources goes, as of today, the development of logic chips requires the most of the resources, because they are the ones who are driving, in our kind of industry's parlance, is the technology driver. The requirements drive the development of new technology, new equipment, new processes, new materials, new devices, new design. Those applications drive with AI, it drives big computers that can crunch these numbers for the AI models. And it also drives the development of computing chips that are so energy efficient. You can do things on the edge, what they call the edge of the internet. You go buy a VR AR headset today, you have to have a battery pack to come with it. And it's not the end state of VR AR headset. I'm pretty sure about that. Right? In the final analysis, VR AR headset is not going to operate like that. Yeah. But this is kind of like the intermediate stage that you need to go through. Just like cell phones used to be like sizable brick. Yeah. Right. And
I remember those.
You remember those, right?
In the early 90s.
In the early 90s, right? And those can only make a call and cannot do anything else.
Right.
And I will tell you a story. When I was at IBM, I used to work on image sensors. And in the mid 90s, I had an idea. I filed an invention disclosure about putting a camera on a phone, on a cell phone.
This was in the 90s, right?
It was in the 90s. And the IBM lawyers said, who wants a camera with a phone? We're not filing this
Say
time.
no more.
So after like months, I finally convinced them to file it, and we do have a patent on that.
They had a great ability of prognosticating about the future.
Right. So all these things, all the progress that we desire the chips to have, we desire the chips to have these capability today is driven by computing means. But it doesn't mean that it will continue to be the case. It doesn't mean that. And also it doesn't mean that there's no real need for innovation in other places. For example, just take image sensor, for example. Tremendous innovation in image sensor. And they offer new capability in VR headsets. You need to have new innovations in image sensor and the way they receive the signal, convert it, and do processing right up front, not right at the sensor end and not back in the mainframe computer. So all these innovation needs to happen in order to kind of satisfy our society's demand for technology in general. If you look at, for example, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, I basically go through all of them and say, hey, at least 12, 13 of them require advances in computing technology and chips technology in general. So without those, all those development goals will be severely curtailed.
The backers of all these are consisting of the designers and the manufacturers, right?
Yes.
Now, the Qualcomms of the world, the NVIDIAs of the world, they seem to be content with just designing, right? How do you see the progression going forward, or the shifting going forward? Are you likely, or are we likely to see them moving in the direction of manufacturing, given the complications or potential complications that we might see in the context of this polarization?
Wonderful observation. 30 some years ago, when Morris Chang came up with this split between fabless, namely companies that only design and do not have any factory for building chips, and foundries focus on building chips and not designing anything. That demarcation, that split, caused a blossoming of design activities, because people who design do not need to own the capital and all the baggage of owning a factory. And so they could then specialize on doing design. At the same time, people who own the factory can specialize on running the factory, and also having the benefits of having zillions of customers instead of one customer. If I manufacture my chip, I sell my chips directly to the customer, then I need not only one customer, that's myself. That's not enough to have scale, to have this economy of scale for the manufacturing. So this split has really blossomed in terms of making the design ideas go a lot faster than before, and created a lot of business opportunity that did not exist before. Because previously you have to have tremendous capital investment before you can design your own chip. Now you don't. You just have to design, and somebody will make it. Now that split has gone on really well for the last 30 some years. But today, if you look at the fabless and the foundry, they're not really split. They're actually together. Companies like Apple, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, AMD, they show up at the foundries every day. They tell the foundry, hey, run this wafer, try this experiment, show me the results, give me the wafers so I can test it myself. So they are actually doing a lot of the development work of the chip itself. So the leading edge technology basically are today co-developed between the foundry and the leading user. Whoever placed the largest order have a big say in how the technology is going to be designed and optimized.
But what about skin on the game, though, in terms of manufacturing capabilities? Are they likely to put more skin on it?
It seems to be the case. There are indicators in there already. For example, Sony put in money in Japan and kind of work with, collaborate with TSMC to build a factory. In Europe, the collection of automobile companies putting their money down to build a factory there. So you're seeing some of that. And how far it will go is not clear, but you beginning to see some of that.
Talk about this company in Amsterdam or in Netherlands, ASML.
Mm-hmm.
They make a pretty fancy technology, fancy. Right? Ultraviolet lithography.
Yeah.
That's well needed for a bunch of things, right? Talk about that.
Oh, that's history. A technology marvel. Yeah. If you go into the details of how this machine, the EUV machine, the extreme ultraviolet lithography machine, is really an engineering marvel. Now, it is also a statement about two things. One, it's a statement about a global supply chain. The laser come from San Diego. The lens is polished in Germany. The mechanical movement came from Connecticut. So it's not just the Netherlands. It's a global supply chain of not only the machine parts itself, but also the knowledge, a global supply chain of knowledge. That's one. The other one is an example of open science. The first EUV papers were published in the late 80s by a group at Bell Labs, and then followed by a bunch of conferences in which researchers in Japan and in Europe all participated. And those formed, and then the US national labs participated in the development of the early prototypes in the Department of Energy, the national labs. All these, and then companies start coming in, Intel, TSMC, and so on, and start investing. And we're talking about global companies, right, not just one country, global companies investing in it. And years later, 30-some years later, or maybe 40-some years later, you have this wonderful machine. And that's all coming from a global collaboration of researchers, generating knowledge, sharing the knowledge, and bootstrapping from themselves. And that's a very important lesson for us to learn, is that if you cordon yourself off from the rest of the world, you wouldn't be able to achieve that. Or even if you are able to do that, you will take a much longer time, and you lose the window of opportunity. That's a very important lesson to learn in this days and age of geopolitical tension, and everybody wants to kind of have everything to themselves and not sharing with each other. If you don't share, you don't gain. You gain back more than we share. I think that's basically how I would characterize it.
You breed a sense of optimism just by way of how the intertwining of different stakeholders in multiple countries. You seem to suggest that serves as a structural cohesive force for
Yes.
that to be it's very difficult to rip it apart.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And if you do rip it apart, you lose.
Everybody loses.
Everybody lose. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody lose.
But, given the fact that we're seeing so much political neurosis in many parts of the world,
Yes.
right? Sometimes people don't act rationally.
Yes.
They act based on what their heart tells you, not what their brain tells you. Isn't that a risk?
Yes, there's a risk. But I think in some parts, I think it's due to the lack of understanding rather than any bad intent. It's not because somebody's bad intention or anything like that, but I think it's more like a lack of understanding. I came to that observation through my participation in a study from the Hoover Institution about 2 years ago. They had a study about U.S., China, Taiwan, and semiconductors. And they published, after 2 years, they published a report called Silicon Triangle. You can go on the Hoover website and download it. And through that participation, I understand, my observation is that many of the people in the policy circle, they don't understand the technology.
Yeah.
Therefore, because of this lack of understanding, they would make policy that really doesn't make sense from a technology. If you do have this technology underpinning, it doesn't make sense. Now, it doesn't mean that the people making policy meant bad or anything like that. It's just a lack of understanding. And it also doesn't mean that the people making policy are dumb or anything like that. It's not. Nobody understands everything under the world, right? Today, they may be making policy about the pandemic, and tomorrow they may be making policy for semiconductor chips, and the next day maybe nuclear arms, right? So there's no way anybody, any single person or even a group of persons can understand everything under the world, right? But I think policymaking would really be helped if there are more people who have domain expertise are participating in the formulation of the policy. And today, I think we have very few people who understand, at least in the semiconductor space that I'm familiar with, who are materially participating in the formulation of the policies. And I think that is a big hole that we need to fill.
Do you suggest a higher degree of cultural interaction?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right? I get the sense that people are not spending enough time in each other's places.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
Like I said, while I was participating in this Hoover study, many of them are policy people, China experts, and so on. And at the end of the study, we all understand a little bit more about what the other people are experts about. I didn't know anything about China policy or industrial policy before, but I have at least some introductory understanding about it by now. And my colleagues likewise have some introductory understanding about semiconductors. They wouldn't ask the question, why not a full conductor anymore?
I had to ask you that. and I gotta ask you, what's the difference between oil and chips? I know you've been asked that. What's the difference between oil and chips?
What's the difference between oil and chips? Yeah, that's right.
I mean, people have been saying chips is the new oil.
Yeah. So I participated in this Hoover Institution study, and a lot of people say, chips, we need chips, and chips are everywhere. Anything that you need to turn on the power, have a battery in it, or plug into a wall, involve some kind of a chips. You roll up your car window, there's a chip. You listen to a podcast, you need a chip. Everything is a chip. So it's like commodity. It's like oil. We need oil. We need fossil fuel, right? So people make a comparison between oil and chips, and that comparison is pretty prevalent in a policy circle.
Right.
Okay. Now,
but it's misplaced.
I think it's totally misplaced. And when I made that comment at the study, and people look at me and say, "Oh yeah, okay, why is it different?" Chips are a lot like oil because oil has been in the ground for millions of years. It never change. You dig it up today, you dig it up tomorrow, it's the same oil. The method of digging may be different, but the oil is the same. Chips are not. You have phones, you have watches, you have your TVs. Would you like to use a phone that was made 20 years ago? Would you like to watch a TV that was made 20 years ago? You don't, because chips constantly advance, and it has to constantly advance to show its value. People expect chips to continuously advance in its capability. Capability broadly defined as in amount of things, the kind of things that they can do, and also energy efficiency. Don't burn up so much energy or power. Don't use up that much battery power, and so on. So the chips is useful to us because it's valuable to us because it advances constantly. It constantly renews itself. Chips today is different from chips tomorrow. You want the chips tomorrow, not the chips of yesterday. Now, oil is not the same. You can stockpile oil, no doubt. And in America, it does that. Many countries do that too. You don't stockpile chips. A stockpile that you have
obsolete.
is not useful very soon.
Every couple of years, they're going to be obsolete.
Yeah, every couple of years obsolete. Yeah, exactly.
Is it feasible to attain chip sovereignty or an absolute chip sovereignty?
Given the nature that we just talked about, the global nature.
I know, I'm imagining.
It's not possible. It's not possible. I think whoever suggests that in policy circle is probably not having enough understanding about how the thing works.
Then I got to ask you the following question. In the worst case scenario, where we're seeing some unintended consequence or episode, happening in the Taiwan Straits, what would happen?
Well, let me quote two sources. One, according to a McKinsey report, it would be worse than the pandemic economically. Second, you probably have seen the interview on TV of the TSMC chairman, Mark Liu. Question was posed to him by the reporter. And I would like to quote his response. Say, if such a thing happened, you have more things to worry about than just chips. Just make sure that it doesn't happen.
I'll pray.
Let's make sure it doesn't happen.
Well, we've talked a lot. Any final messages, Philip, to people in Southeast Asia or anywhere around the world so that they can feel more optimistic about they're becoming much more, positive and constructive about attaining STEM capabilities, hopefully some sort of manufacturing capabilities too, and being able to be collaborative with the rest of the world and all that?
Well, one of the things that turned out to be positive thing for kind of developing countries or countries who are interested in advanced manufacturing, generally speaking, not just chips, but advanced manufacturing, is that because of the renewed sense of sensitization to supply chain resiliencies and so on, there is more of a diversification effort going on right now that these countries who are historical in the past haven't really participated in this space have a great opportunity right now. And that means they need to be prepared to take this opportunity that is opening up to them. And that means, taking from the Taiwan experience that I mentioned to you that we discussed earlier, that means talent cultivation and government policy to support it, and general society, local society to support it. In terms of talent, by the way, a lot of people talk about workforce development.
Yep.
I actually don't like that word that much. I like to call it talent cultivation, because it's really talent, not just workers who repeatedly do the same thing, but really people who can continually learn and try do new things and understand the things what they're doing and be able to improve on it. Those are what talent would do, right? Not just generally workforce in the traditional sense of the word. And the other aspect is this general society support of the industry. I'll give you another interesting story. TSMC wanted to build a new factory in Hsinchu, in the place where they have a lot of factories. And the government zoned a piece of land for them. Unfortunately, there is a temple, a historical temple in that piece of land. I read about this in the newspaper. So, and of course, temple is sacred and nobody wants to move the temple. But then at the end of the day, they decided to, okay, I can relocate the temple for you. That's an important statement about how the general society support the economic development.
They know where the priorities are.
They know where the priorities are, right? And that's a really strong statement to support the society.
Let me ask you, with the benefit of hindsight, if there wasn't a meeting between Morris Chang and a public official who had the authority and also the vision, well, both of them had a vision, right? Would there be in TSMC?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Perhaps. I mean, history developed the way it is because of certain events, certain people, right?
It's serendipitous.
Yeah, it's really, there's a Chinese saying that whether it's the situation that created the hero or the hero that created the situation, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of both. Right. Even if there is an official who started a conversation with a certain person, if that person is not astute enough, then there's nothing that's going to happen. Or if there's a very visionary person, but there's no corresponding government official who sees things the same way, nothing's going to happen. I think it's a little bit of both. And I think it's a little bit of both. And earlier you asked about any lessons about Southeast Asian countries. I think there's also a lesson to be learned in the U.S. as well. In the U.S., we talk about onshoring manufacturing. To me, it sounded like giving a fish to somebody. Yeah. You haven't taught them how to fish.
Yeah. I agree.
Right, and that's important to understand. And the other thing is manufacturing and innovation or R&D, research and development, go hand in hand. Manufacturing is not just doing repeatedly the same thing to a recipe. There's a lot of innovation on the manufacturing floor, how to improve on the manufacturing process, how do you get better yield, how do you turn the current generation of technology a little bit better so that you can offer a newer version of this technology based on this current one. Just slight change, not big change, but slight change that provide value to your customer. How do you do that? And TSMC does that a lot. Every generation, they will come up with innovation on the manufacturing floor that turn it into a product that's slightly better than the previous one, that brings the customer in. You can tell the customer, hey, for a small price increase, you could get much better performance or energy efficiency or better cost that doesn't require you to go to the next jump. That's value to the customer. Yeah. So the manufacturing and research and development and innovation really go hand in hand. Yeah. That's one piece, one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that research and development has to be really close to manufacturing. Otherwise, you're dreaming up with solutions that not manufacturable. And how do you know what is manufacturable or not? Yeah. By being very close to the manufacturing floor. So in other words, it is very difficult to have the research and development divorced from the manufacturing. And so if we just say, hey, company X, just come to Ohio, Arizona, Texas, whatever, and build your fab, that's, I think, just basically isolate that so-called manufacturing from the rest of it. It's not going to be successful.
You got to be cognizant of the inseparability of the two components. Those are two sides of the same coin.
Those are two sides of the same coin. You cannot just say, I only bring manufacturing onshore and I don't do the R&D, and that's very important. So in other words, all these chips subsidies of $52 billion of
the
CHIPS Act, right? 39 billion goes to the manufacturing subsidies and 11 billion go to R&D.
Should be flipped.
Well, it may not be flipped because it takes more effort, more money to do the manufacturing, but the importance of which is flipped.
The R&D.
The most important one is the $11 billion. If you,
I agree.
If you do that part right, I'm saying that not because I'm an academic, I do research, right? But if you don't do
I would
this
even
right,
put a greater number for R&D.
Exactly.
Than 11.
Right. That has to be done right. Otherwise, you'll get a fish and you ate that fish and then that's it.
You got to teach the fishermen how to fish.
Absolutely. And I think that is the most important thing. And for the fishermen to be successful, you need to be able to talk to other fishermen.
Yeah.
Where, so that you know where the fish is.
Yeah. And you got to have a boat.
Yes. You can have a boat, yes.
You know, there has been a lot of rhetoric about friendshoring, reshoring, offshoring, right? In the last few years. But if you take a look at the empirical evidence, call it Southeast Asia, capital formation hasn't really moved up in a meaningful manner. And I would speculate or even hypothesize that a lot of that is because of the lack of investment on a human capital, right? And the onus is really upon us to get our act together. You know, there is a desire to reshore. There is a desire to relocate. But if we're not ready, you know, it's not going to come.
Yeah. Well,
and it hasn't come as much as we would have hoped for.
Yeah, to capture the opportunity, you need to be prepared. And this talent cultivation is really to be prepared. You look at China as an example. They graduate more engineers than anybody in the world.
Yeah.
And that's how they becomes a manufacturing hub of the world. And to go to Shenzhen, it's unbelievable. If you want to build something, some hardware, you got to be there.
Yeah.
They have not only the people, but also the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And the people is really amazing. They know how to do things. And so you need that investment.